really sorry. I'll just take 1 second. There's this. Yeah, it started. I'm really sorry for
All
this.
right, go
So,
ahead.
our first presentation is by Dr. Uzma Abid Ansari. She's from Namal Islamabad, National University of Modern Languages, and she'll be presenting on Arhan Pamuk's work. So over to you, Dr. Uzma.
Thank you, Rida, and thank you, Dr. Amna Umarchima, and everyone here who's attending. So today I'm going to be talking about what's actually a smaller part of a chapter from my thesis, my PhD thesis, and I've titled it Orhan Pamuk's Construction of a Counter-Signifying Regime, a Literary Practice in Decoloniality. So I'm going to be turning on presentation mode and share the slides with you. Okay, I hope this is visible.
Yes, we can.
Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read from my paper. And in between, if there's anything I need to explain, I'll just stop and explain. So, okay. In this paper, I argue that the representation of Persian pre-modern miniatures in Turkish writer Orhan Pamuk's oeuvre is related to a concept of nomadism, which stands in opposition to a settled or sedentary society. And when deployed figuratively, it functions as a disruptive element within a mimetic society and carries the potential to decolonize the modern Turkish novel. This concept was initially introduced by Deleuze and Guattari in their essay on the Nomadic War Machine, which appeared in their work A Thousand Plateaus. I will show with evidence from Pamuk's text how Pamuk uses the motif of miniatures as a concept which facilitates the bringing to light of the counter-signifying regime of what Deleuze and Guattari call the nomad. In order to demonstrate how the concept of the nomad illustrates Pamuk's practice in decoloniality, a brief overview of the nomadic war machine is, I think, required. So I will move on to the second slide. This is a very comprehensive and interesting diagram that I found on the internet, and it explains only the counter-signifying regime of the nomad vis-a-vis the sedentary state model. So the nomadic war machine is a figurative title for elements in and around the state that work in opposition to its apparatuses in a metaphoric exteriority of the state that is a counter-signifying regime. So over here, you can just see, I don't want to go into too much detail of the theory because I want to discuss the images that Pamuk has used and he's deploying in his novels and his work of prose. So this is basically it. And for those of you who are familiar with Deleuze and Guattari, I think this is a very simplified and comprehensive model, so it should work. And we find an allegorical comparison with nomadic hordes that disrupted established universal states or empires, or what could be called signifying regimes. So the sedentary also represents the signifying regime of a universal state, and the nomad represents the counter-signifying regime of a disruptive element in the exteriority of the state. Now, the war machine can be understood with the allegory of Genghis Khan or Genghis Khan, the quintessential nomad, leading a horde against the cities of a universal state, or more in a nutshell, the nomad against the city. This then is the function of the nomad war machine, or the counter-signifying regime. This first image that I used in my first slide is actually a miniature painting of the city of Baghdad being ambushed by a horde of nomadic Mongols. And this is the urban center which was destroyed by this more mobile force outside of the city. Now, the modern state is virtually and irrevocably bound to a science or a discourse perpetuated by a public intellectual who is an embodiment of the exchange that takes place between the state and reason, with the state ultimately being conceived of as realized reason. Conversely, there exists a force external to the state apparatus that destroys both the image and its copies, the model and its reproductions, every possibility of subordinating thought to a model of Cartesian truth. So, the model of Cartesian truth is embodied in the modern nation state, which was built on the Enlightenment model of, the kind of Enlightenment philosophy that ensued after the early period of modern history. So this is nomad thought in juxtaposition to the sedentary state, which is not anchored in a totalitarian regime, but instead originates in a milieu of smooth space traversed by a singular tribal race. And this tribal race is obviously, it's just a metaphorical understanding of it. It doesn't literally mean a tribal race. This milieu, interestingly enough, literally happens to be a part of a nomadic culture which Pamuk deploys time and again to counter the Republican narrative. Rather than being a narrative, however, it comes across as a sign regime, a semiotic system composed of sign elements interspersed in the narrative of the Republic, yet one which questions its authenticity. These sign elements happen to fall into the realm of art, primarily epic poetry and miniature painting, which are relics from a sign regime from its more pre-modern past, from Turkey's more pre-modern or pre-Western past. In Pamuk's work, the miniature works as a signifier of such a counter-signifying nomadic regime. Pamuk explores this counter-signifying regime in a chapter titled Black Ink in his book Other Colors, which is a work of non-fiction. It's a compilation of essays written by him. So in Other Colors, he says that he makes a study of a miniature from the Il Khanate period's Siyah Kalam genre, which depicts a small group of nomadic men in conversation with one another, with one man in the center sitting astride a donkey. And I think this is the miniature painting that Pamuk actually writes about. And he talks about this miniature in isolation. In a style reminiscent of My Name is Red, which is his novel, a work of fiction, the narrative voice in this largely prose collection switches to that of the subjects depicted in the painting. So that instead of Pamuk's authorial voice, the nomads in the miniature painting are speaking. It is relevant to note that when he depicts miniature painting and drawings in his works, Pamuk, or the narrator, as in the case of My Name is Red, adopts the role of a traditional storyteller. So these men are in this miniature painting, they are a group of nomadic men who are apparently traveling through a desert. And they take a break and a storyteller starts telling them stories as a way of passing time or entertainment. Slipping into this role allows Pamuk to explore the oral tradition of story and poetry recitation, which was found across borders between the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Sultanate, and even up to China. While examining this miniature, Pamuk first discusses the unique style with which the nomad men and their donkey have been drawn, and the name of the artist, an elusive Muhammad Siyah Kalam, or Muhammad of the Black Pen, is mentioned in connection with the style of drawing with thick black and white lines favored by Turco-Persian artists in the 15th century. The chapter's narrative hinges on identifying who the three nomads are, and the narrator laments the fact that if only the story to which this painting belonged had not been lost, the identity of the nomads depicted could have been verified. The stories that have been lost, which were so enmeshed with the miniatures which illustrated them, represent a semiotic system whose absence or loss renders the identity of the nomads illegible and unascertainable. The nomads themselves represent a counter-signifying regime which carries the potential, if revived, to disrupt the signifying regime of the totalitarian nation-state. A marked feature of the nation-state is its defined and reified borders, while the nomads, particularly the ones chosen by Pamuk, reinforce the idea of a borderless terrain. The implication, now, the implication of the deployment of this image is that the blank background to the three nomads would not have been featureless had there been a story accompanying them, as it traditionally would have done had the miniature not been parted from the manuscript or artist's book to which it had originally belonged. Now, Muhammad Siya Kalam, historically, he did exist, and he basically started this style of miniature paintings in which he used a particularly West Asian or Mongol type of drawing style, using a really thick black pen to draw the outline of the figures. And as you can see, the color black is very prominent. He used black ink, and he used blue and red a lot in his paintings. And the thing is that these miniatures, just a little bit of a background now, these miniatures were supposed to accompany stories or epic poetry, or they were supposed to act as extensions of a text in a manuscript. But what Pamuk is saying is that we have lost that text, and the only thing that remains are these miniatures. So the tragedy is that we've lost the stories, we've lost the narrative behind these miniatures. The open space of the blank page signifies two things: the loss of a story which would have lent identity to the three nomads, and the smooth space of nomadic landscape which transcends and sabotages the unequivocal parameters of the nation state. In this way, as a material object, a miniature functions as an instrument of what Deleuze and Guattari call a nomad science, of a nomadic sign regime which stands in contrast to the signs of the signifying regime of the state. The nomadic science is something which you could call a discourse of, like a discourse embedded in scientific or empirical epistemology that was really glorified and projected and then globalized after the Enlightenment in Europe. Now, this nomadic sign regime belongs to the cultural heritage of Turkey, which has its roots not only in the Turkic tribes of West Asia, but also in Arab, Persian, Mongol, and even Chinese cultures. Pamuk has deliberately picked this particular art form to juxtapose it with European visual arts, such as Renaissance painting, to underscore not difference, but the alternative possibilities to perspective, or a vague signs in the face of the signs of the state. So Deleuze and Guattari have, in their a little booklet on the Nomadic War Machine, they talk about a vague signs as opposed to the signs of the state. And these miniatures could be part of a semiotic system that stands for that vague signs. Now, his own artistic form of expression, that is to say Pamuk's, is the novel, which is originally and foremost a European literary form, yet he has incorporated intertextual references in his plots that point towards traditional Middle Eastern and Central Asian literature. In a chapter from Other Colors, on his period novel My Name is Red, Pamuk writes, "My novel's central concern to blend the more distilled and poetic style derived from works in the style of Persian miniatures with the speed, power, and character-driven realism of the novel as we understand it today. My novel travels between these two poles of intimacy and recognition on the one hand and remoteness and generalities on the other. The characters in the book also view nature through pictures or archetypes. Now, this is still Pamuk speaking. This is the part of the book I love the most. This comes from the part of me that burns with the desire to take the cultural past, our traditions, and play with it to produce new effects, end quote. The perspective of miniatures, which is archetypal rather than realistic, is pivotal in challenging modern state-sponsored narratives which are constructed on Western epistemological grounds. Pamuk's intention is to disrupt a worldview grounded in that epistemology. Unlike Renaissance realism achieved through the use of perspective, that is, depth and shadow, Persian miniatures represented only archetypes with subject matter mostly from poetry. Archetypal characters would be characters that that do not display any depth of features, and their background is also depthless. It's like a two-dimensional image, as opposed to a Renaissance painting from that time, which had depth and perspective, and it had, the effect of distance could be perceived in a painting. But as you can see in these miniatures, distance cannot be perceived. So this goes to show that these characters, they represent archetypes of either legends or myths or human beings. So narrative poetry and epics are another form of the alternative that Pamuk wishes to employ in order to dislodge, or at least inform, the readers' West-based narrative archetypes. So with works like My Name is Red, Pamuk not only challenges the Republican narrative, but also unsettles its epistemology by introducing a counter-signifying regime with an alternative semiotic system and hence an alternative idiom. This alternative semiotic system could alternately be called a nomad science. An instance of its representation in My Name is Red is as the color red narrates the story of Rustam from the story of Rustam and Sohrab.
Dr. Uzma, I am sorry to intervene, but you might have to conclude very soon. We're very
Okay,
low
yeah.
on time.
Yes,
Sorry.
I'll quickly finish this. So this miniature is from the epic poem of Rustam and Sohrab, most probably from I think the Shahnama in Persian, and I've just written the quotation over here of how the color red represents Rustam and his story, and so on and so forth. Now, another novel of Pamuk's, Snow, which is his only political work of fiction, over there, the story of the legendary hero Rustam appears as a counter-signifying regime to the signifying regime of the Turkish Republic. There's a section where the character Blue narrates the most important section of the myth of Rustam. The story reaches a climax with Rustam realizing that he has killed his only son and that he will die an issueless old man. So as we all know the story of Rustam and Sohrab, and we know that the story actually reaches its climax with Rustam, the hero, killing his son unknowingly. This, I wanted to read this out, but I'm not sure if I will have time or not, so I'll leave it for the end if there's still time. So in this instance, Blue, which is a character of a terrorist, Islamic terrorist in that novel. He is lamenting the loss of issue, the loss of children. Like Rustam lost a child by killing him himself. So Blue is also lamenting the loss of issue, though in his case, it is not childlessness that he grieves, but the loss of narrative. This is the Jungian narrative archetype that Pamuk discusses in Other Colors. In the words of the character Blue, the modern Turks seem to have lost their own stories and have latched onto Western myths as narrative archetypes. Blue also makes a comparison with the story of Oedipus Rex, which is similar to the story of Rustam and Sohrab because it constitutes the same father and son dynamic, with neither of the two having a clue about the other's identity, yet it is not the same at all because in Oedipus Rex, the son unknowingly kills the father, right? And So Pamuk wishes to point out this fundamental difference because it gives meaning to each story, and in doing so, it affects the lives of those who read it. And we know how state science, which is modern state science, is built upon the story of the signifying regime that is coming from the West. With the we're well versed in the Oedipal complex and Freudian theories, all of them based on this archetypal myth of Oedipus Rex. The stories about which Pamuk feels so strongly are also part of the counter narrative he gives, and this can be seen as a counter signifying regime to the narrative of the West adopted by the Turkish Republic. I see his bringing up of Persian Islamic stories or Perso Islamic stories as a way of countering the sign regime of the westernizing state with a semiotic system that poses a soft challenge to the narrative of the national or nationalistic intellectuals. This is the nomadic sign regime because it is not an institutionalized or reified system that could be imposed on the existing one, but one that is fluid and offers possibilities only of alternative ways of viewing things, finding meaning, and even an eventual paradigm shift that could initially lead to delinking with the semiotic system embedded in Enlightenment epistemology. Do I still have time?
Unfortunately, no, ma'am. Very
Okay.
sorry about that.
So, well, okay, that's it from my side then. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Uzma. Next, we have Dr. Mariam Zia from Lahore School of Economics, and she'll be presenting on uncanny and ajibo gharib. But before Dr. Mariam starts, I have very small. I have to say this. Very sorry about that. But we just have 10 to 15 minutes for each panelist because due to online system we have these sorts of time constraints. Very sorry. Over to you, Dr. Mariam.
Thank you, Rida. I hope everybody can view my screen.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's my pleasure to present for Punjab University after a hiatus of many years. At the outset, I would like to mention that this paper I'll be presenting today has already been published in the Oxford Literary Review in the December 2020 special issue. And also, I'd like to thank Professor Asif Tikhar for all his help with the Arabic translation and transliterations that I had to go through in order to write this paper. Negotiating meaning, the case of the uncanny and ajibo-gharib. Reaching any understanding of the uncanny is to hover too close to the sun on waxen wings. It's a soaring and an undoing. Invariably, one falls short in language, in feeling, and in state. It comes with only a semblance of conviction regarding meaning. Thinking and writing about the concept is to reach a tacit understanding with the self that one will always be in a state of territorial instability and that the only way out of the foreignness will be a cessation of thinking and feeling. Temporality is the only certainty. Each reading of Sigmund Freud's 1919 essay, The Uncanny, is a re-entanglement. The uncanny is in translation as we speak. To experience it, it is always also to translate it in a territorial negotiation of sorts. Will there be a terminus? Perhaps not. But despite the vertiginous difficulty, to use Nicholas Royal's phrase, of the task of translating the word and the emotion, it is still necessary. The uncanny does not merely startle or make you flinch. Its enduring, stable presence is a strong undercurrent in seemingly homely waters, to be taken for granted and accepted with patience. One stumbles upon information hidden in textual corners, which, once it comes to light, consumes the reader. Among the many languages that Freud turns to in his essay, in Arabic and Hebrew languages, He says, the word unheimlich means the same as demonic or gruesome. While this paper is concerned with the Arabic translation only, in Hebrew too, the uncanny, to my knowledge, does not mean the same as demonic. In a personal communication with Julia Rubanovich, senior lecturer at the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, she writes, the usual dictionary gives the meaning of supernatural, al-tawi. Freud's German term, unheimlich, is usually translated as muyan, or threatened, or mavhil, scary or spooky. So there is an element of fear, but not of anything demonic. Freud seems to have been led down the wrong path by the translator and the translation. His turning to other languages and concluding with an escape clause, perhaps only because we speak a language that is foreign, is an experiential foreignness. In this implicitly totalizing state, translation becomes a necessity and an impossibility, both for a conversation with the self and the other. The certainty of foreignness is destabilized in Freud's use of the word perhaps. Do we speak a language that is foreign? For surely, if we did not, there would have been certitude, if only a semblance thereof. Freud's predilection for smooth solutions and lucid exposition leads him to dictionaries. The uncertainty of, and I quote, not being at home demands the comfort of stable meaning. Foreignness is inherent and visible in Freud's translation of the meaning of the word in Arabic. I suggest translating the uncanny as ajibo gharib, a word that captures the sense of what Anthony Vidya calls lurking unease within the concept of the uncanny. The two synonyms for the word uncanny, according to the Hans Wehr Dictionary of Modern Written Arabic, are khariq al-tabiya, that which breaks or violates nature, supernatural, and gharib, strange, odd, out of the ordinary. Freud might have misconstrued nuances of the verbal form gharaba from the root gharaba. In specific appropriations, such nuances might have been constructed so as to afford a sense of the demonic. It is the word gharib or strange that is representative of the special core of feeling that we are concerned with in a definition of the uncanny, rather than a possible appropriation of gharaba. The demonic is a fixed, appropriated category that results in a peculiar commingling of emotion and lends the uncanny its special place in art and literature. In its compound form with the word ajib, it captures within it the resulting emotion of ta'ajub, becoming affected with wonder regarding the nature of a thing or an event. This translation is also suggestive of the need for patience as to its ephemeral instability of meaning when associated with a lack of knowledge regarding the conundrum of belief. Hans Wehr describes the word ajib, adjectival noun, from the root word ajaba as wonderful, wondrous, marvelous, admirable, astonishing, amazing, remarkable, strange, odd, while ajab is defined as to strike with astonishment or wonder. The classical Arab English lexicon, 1863, also uses the word wonder to define ajab. He deemed it strange, extraordinary, or improbable, said of a thing occurring or presenting itself to him on account of his being little accustomed to it, the wondering at a thing of which the cause or reason is hidden, not known, the effect upon the mind of the consideration of a thing with which one is not familiar, to which one is not accustomed. Under the overarching category of wonder, then, these two definitions of the word ajib capture the three elements that connect it to the uncanny in emotion and thought. the disquieting surprise as one stumbles upon something in oneself or in the external world that presents itself as the unfamiliar. 2. The desire for knowledge regarding that to which one is little accustomed but not oblivious. And 3. A hesitating evaluation of its nature, whereby one can wonder and deem it strange. Martin Heidegger's analysis is illuminating to our discussion of wonder, or Thalmasian, in this context. The wondrous is first of all what is striking, remarkable, an exception to the habitual, says Heidegger. We call it the curious or the amazing. To be amazed is to find oneself in the face of the inexplicable, and indeed in such a way that in this disposition, the inexplicability is sustained. This is not to suggest that uncanniness is a feeling of wonder alone, but rather to suggest a flickering of wonder within feelings, wonder and patience, to live with and in untranslatability are inherent to the concept. The strangeness fundamental to the uncanny is found in the word gharib. Hans Wehr provides the following synonyms: strange, foreign, peculiar, astonishing, wondrous, marvelous, grotesque. The Arabic English lexicon gives this definition: to be stranger or a foreigner, one far or distant from his home or native country, those who have migrated towards Maghrib, westward or where the sun sets, and live in a state of strangeness. To be held or reckoned strange, far from being intelligible, difficult to be understood, obscure or extraordinary, unfamiliar or unusual, and improbable. The word gharib glimpses the obscurity and the sense of not being at home of the word and the concept of the uncanny. In its compound with ajib, it represents the totality of the uncanny. However, as Walter Benjamin states, all translation is only a somewhat provisional way of coming to terms with the foreignness of languages. The translation and the implicit theorization of the Freudian uncanny as a jibo-gharib will, as a supplement, also be a step towards creating linkages between Middle Eastern and South Asian literatures and cultures and the current Maghribi or Western understanding of the concept. For the moment, I suggest we learn to live with a lingering sense of wonder. Ajibo-gharib is how it is. I thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mariam.
You're welcome.
Next, we have Mr. Wasim Haider from University of Central Punjab, and he'll be presenting on the dynamics of neo-colonialism. Over to you, Mr. Wasim.
Thank you very much. Okay, Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, everyone. I'll try to keep things short and I'll be quick because I know the time is very short. So the basic idea is of new colonialism, the dynamics of new colonialism, and Adichie has represented new colonialism in numerous ways, and this study basically analyzes this text in the framework of Frantz Fanon's thought on decolonization and Gayatri Spivak's views on new colonialism. As she says that new colonialism as a colonization has never ended, and newly independent states never actually feel the true freedom and independence. And these newly independent states, newly independent countries, there is a class which Fanon terms as national bourgeois, who control everything after the independence of those countries. As Pivek says that conventional colonization is no more in practice, because after the end of colonization in different countries, and specifically we are talking about Nigeria over here, that period of colonization ended, and non-conventional colonization, which is new colonization, as she says that new colonialism is like radiation. You feel like you're free, but you're actually being controlled in so many ways, and I'll explain those ways, that what are those ways which have been represented in this novel. And talking about Gramsci, he compares a hegemonic state to a parasite who's there to actually extract the wealth and all of the sources and resources from those countries. So, as I already explained, it fundamentally analyzes the question of political and economic stability of post-colonial Nigeria, because this novel is set in the backdrop of Nigerian civil war. And in that civil war, there are certain driving forces which temper the Nigerian peace for their own capitalistic gains. And those strategies of new colonialism, they put African nationalism under question, because there is a tussle between two groups, Hausa and other Igbo. These are two groups over there in Nigeria in the Nigerian Civil War, and which have been represented in this novel. With that, she talks about Adichie. She talks about Western media supremacy as well, because the media, Western media, has all the power, and this peripheral voice of Nigerians is subjugated throughout this novel. And they, of course, they temper the Nigerian peace as well, because it is in their vested interest. Starting with the first running idea of new colonialism, which is there in Half of a Yellow Sun, that is continuation of lingual hegemony, because she says there are certain characters. I'll give you an example of a boy who is a village boy, who is uneducated and who is very much fascinated by English language. He feels inferior because he can't speak English. So the basic idea is Nigeria has been decolonized, apparently, but still that lingual hegemony and lingual supremacy of English language is still there. And he has this fear because he is working as a houseboy, and he has this fear that he will lose his job because his master, who is a Nigerian professor, uh, and the boy thinks that he will lose his job because he can't speak English just like his master. And he keeps on glamorizing English language. And Adichie explains this idea that how uh, those formerly colonized people, they still are facing this kind of hegemony of language that they still fear, and they still have this inferiority complex, that because if they can't speak good English, um, they are not that much of a human. And there is another running idea basically, where Adichie questions that if someone speaks good English, will it make him less savage? Because they have constructed these binaries, and you are familiar with this term savage. Of course, it is based on the backdrop of Nigerian civil war, which is also known as Biafran War. So it is newly independent state, because the novel is set in 1960s, newly independent state, and still their army has the leaders who belong to those Britishers who have recently left Nigeria. So their GOC is a British person, and there is division within army because they're fighting against the people, their own people, basically, because this is a civil war. And in universities, they have British professors because they haven't left Nigeria completely, and they encouraged these kind of conflicts between people, and they sent their own students. That's another new colonial idea which represents the failure of decolonization, as Frantz Fanon says that this process of decolonization becomes violent sometimes. And of course, they played a very important role, the British officials, because they have control on economy. They are controlling the companies as and national bourgeois, and sometimes national bourgeois is translated as local bourgeois as well. So they have this control on each and every institution, and Nigerians are struggling in order to get the real essence of decolonization. And talking about again corrupt elite, Frantz Fanon says that when these colonizers leave some newly independent countries, the local bourgeois or the local elite class, they step into the shoes of those former colonizers, and they justify their stance that we do deserve to rule these people. So they facilitate, and of course, when they leave, there is another idea of new, which talks about new colonialism in this novel. That when they left Nigeria, they implanted their own favored people over there in the key posts, who kept on facilitating that hegemony. And there is a major character, female character, Olana. Her father is, um, a business tycoon, and he wins some contracts from some corrupt officials because they are facilitating only the elite class, right? So they assume themselves as successor, and there is another idea of not producing their own goods, and they are just selling raw material. And uh, those companies, there are some multinational companies which have been mentioned in this novel. They are the ones who are taking the raw material out of this country and then selling them those goods. Adichie has mentioned numerous mainstream newspapers, because the novel is set in 1960, and electronic media was not in that much practice at that time. So they euphemize the Western control and hegemony, and they are representing only one side of the picture. And there is another book within this book, and which is titled as "The World Was Silent When We Died." So Adichie incorporated another book with this title, and she asserts this idea that Nigerian voice was subjugated and we didn't get that much coverage, or our voice was not heard by the world. And these new colonizers, they were representing only one side of the picture. And there are people who are dying because of civil war. Civilians are dying, innocent people are dying, but still, one European who dies in this novel, he gets more coverage and attention than thousands of dead Nigerians. And I have already talked about these institutions, and the black land is, and resources and people and manpower and women, because they have been represented as the women have been represented in this novel as free sex, that you can the Europeans can use them for their own pleasure. So they have been portrayed as commodities of for the Western powers. And whiteness, or being white privilege, that is, whites are, being white is only form of humanity, which is idea which is there in this novel. And there is a typing mistake. They control immigration, and you can come they can come into your country anytime, but if you want to visit Europe West, you need visa for that. So they have this immigration control as well, which is another form of control. And even after the independence, so-called apparent decolonization of Nigeria, and they are giving favors, of course, to the international organization, the local bourgeoisie, because they have been implanted by the colonizers, the former colonizers. And consumerism, which is another idea of globalization, as well as we can stretch new colonialism to globalization. um, they are consuming those products, and they can't actually produce something of their own, because uh, the system, they systematically are kept as still colonized people, and the colonization is still prevailing in the country even after the independence. So the conclusion, I'll read it as I have written instead of explaining it, that Nigerians having different ethnicities and religious background were merged during the colonial period. That resulted into civil war in the country. The Britain and other world powers did not stop exploiting the Nigerian peace due to economic potential and the oil resources that were extremely valuable to former colonists that had left the country. The local bourgeois and the corrupt political and military elite supported the Western hegemony. The study discloses as hegemonic powers, the local bourgeois had mutual benefits. The new colonial powers implanted their favored people on the key posts and strengthened their reign in the country, because the local bourgeois and the hegemonic powers both had economic interests in Nigeria. Uh, that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wasim.
Thank you.
Now we have Mr. Babur Khan Suri from University of Karachi, and he'll be presenting on politics as politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you and Assalamu alaikum. My topic for today's presentation is basically an analysis of Jose Saramago's novel Seeing, which ironically I had sent in as another novel, that is Blindness. So the confusion between seeing and blindness in itself is pretty ironic here. But Blindness was the first novel, and Seeing is the sequel to his novel Blindness. And obviously, because of the shortage of time, I won't be able to talk about the story in as much detail. But in short, what this novel, that is Seeing, the sequel to his novel Blindness, is about, is that you have this imaginary country, which perhaps his rendition of Portugal, where in the election, the capital, 80% of the residents of the capital, they do not vote. In other words, they go to the polls, but they only deliver blank ballots. And when I read this for the first time, this reminded me of Melville's short story, that is Bartleby the Scrivener. But Bartleby the Scrivener was an attempt at resistance, that is, I prefer not to, on a very individual, personal level. This seems to me something that is closer to political reality, especially in third world countries like ours, where the state has made it into a moral obligation to participate in the political process, but at the state's terms. That is what the state and what the bureaucracy term as political participation. So my argument today is going to be how the idea of political participation, how the meaning of political participation can be wrested from the hands of the political elite. Now, in this novel, we are presented with a thought experiment where something extremely unlikely happens, which is the majority of the population of an imaginary country refusing to take part in the national elections by depositing blank ballots in the ballot boxes. Based on our own experience with elections, we know that there is a huge campaign right before the elections to participate, and with almost moralist threats being leveled against the population, that if they don't, that they're committing sort of a crime or a sin. But in this novel, this act of non-participation, which is almost taken as a center of a nationwide epidemic, which we usually refer to as apathy. But in this particular context, this assumption would be wrong. This seeming apathy turns out to be the most intense case of political participation in that country's history. A political act that creates havoc within the ruling bureaucracy who embark on a witch hunt for the main culprit, who may have instigated this radical act of indifference as radical participation. A political act which does not rely on mass protests or any other popular modes of dissent. This expression of radical political emancipation is performed with an act of writing. Through the blank sheets of paper, the society has collectively created a possibility of expressing that which the closed structure does not allow. The form of expression which is reserved for the creative act of poetry through meaningful silences is performed in mass in order to wrest meaning out of the hands of a reified structure, which has alienated the populace from the very act of creating possibilities for social justice. The blank piece of paper, with regard to its potential for expression, is what I refer to as politics through poetry. Now, the indifference and apathy that I have just referred to has been appropriated here from the popular discourse of political participation and narratives of national duty. An attempt is being made here to reinsert, or to put it more exactly, infect with variations and possibilities and even perhaps fantasies, a discursive structure that provided these terms with the static negative connotations. The absence of dynamism in the expressiveness of emancipatory discourses, democracy in the case of the novel mentioned above, it's precisely what allows the mutation of emancipation into its opposite. An opposite that can perhaps be characterized as a law of language that negates any semantic turbulences. This linguistic restructuring of meaning very rudely confronts the bureaucrats and the bureaucracy of language that extract their political power from the positivistic enforcement of meanings, thereby creating subjectivities that are as prosaic, factual, and well-defined as the bureaucratic discourse itself. The discursive bureaucratization of the political setup in Saramago's imaginary state allows only for public participation on its own terms. You are presented with an array of similar candidates up for elections who only differ in appearance but represent a repetitive pattern that has entrenched itself in the supposed historical and political evolution which the system seemingly guarantees. You are free and you are supposed to be responsible for your freedom. But the discourse that defines and describes this freedom is solidified within an alienating space of meanings where the poetic discourse and dissonance of critical combinations and or redefinitions of words, the very human act of creativity, is not allowed entry. The discourse is presented as the objective expression of the human spirit, and an act of faith in the meaning is demanded in the name of your own spiritual well-being. All hitherto political activity will ensue from this unquestionable meaning of what it means to be free. But in the absence of the poetic intervention into this meaning-making process, the very political acts grounded in solidified meanings that we are to believe as guarantors and agents of our own freedom serve to alienate us from the very thing that we are meant to aspire to. In Seeing, the title suggests that unwritten definition of a truly free political act. Through the poeticity of blankness, the reader is exhorted to see the possibility of a radical act which doesn't exist in the mainstream discourse. The lack of inscription on the ballot paper is an inscription unto itself, which awaits the seeing subject. If we look at the formation of poetic expression within the recognized category of the literary, we will find the same radical linguistic violence operating at the very roots of it. The initial Platonic objection to poetry, that is, it is a lie, thus at a greater distance from any other form of representation of the world, assumes the presence of the same essential meanings that the linguistic bureaucracy of the linguistic political establishments assume. The poetic lie tells the truth through the distortion of established ideals that time has made hollow. I'm not asserting here a necessary subversion to be the only singularity governing the definition of poetry. Neither am I denying the act of subversion to be a possible literary act. What I am referring to here is a greater possibility of truth and meaning provided by the fictive element in fiction. A fiction that illuminates the idea of reality itself. Oscar Wilde, in his very famous dialogue, The Decay of Lying, laments precisely this absence of fiction. And an example of White presents us with is the metaphor of fog, and asserts that if it weren't for poets and their lies, fog would not exist. The emotive linguistic element of fog were added by the poets to make the prosaic idea of fog into something which evokes a secondary thought beyond the purely descriptive. Sadness, for instance, now has a face which goes beyond the human in order to enrich the object to be described. Instead of an actual stem, blankness, in the case of Saramago's novel, is something which actually goes beyond the idea of the everyday idea of political participation. Now, as opposed to the poetic lie, we have the structure of what has been referred to as a bureaucracy. I'm not limiting the idea of bureaucratic control to some, stereotypical sarkari afsar, a representation of a boring behind the desk office job, but rather a cultural phenomena where precisely the person sitting behind the desk is rendered invisible. Its invisibility is due to its omnipresence as a system of unquestionable descriptions of things. This reminds me of a book by Robert Falla. He's a psychoanalyst, and his book published in 2017 called Interpassivity, The Aesthetics of Delegated Enjoyment. In it, as a side note, he describes the bureaucratic function by mentioning, and I'm reading the quotation here. As soon as bureaucracy dominates a field, what happens is a reversal between a description and what is being described. The question is no longer what is the real use, the proper functioning of this practice, and how can we appropriately account for it. What now comes first is the account, the description, whose criteria are never questioned, and then the practice has to be modified so that it allows for a nice description. Bureaucracy always asks itself, what is the description that guarantees our own existence and survival as bureaucracy? And this, by the way, in a sense, is my argument against the usual idea of political participation within a democracy, which only guarantees the presence and the continued survival of oppressive systems themselves. Bureaucracy thus becomes a matter of unquestionable description of things, tyranny of words in a sense. It is within this descriptive mechanism that the populace of the imaginary country presented by Saramago seeing finds itself and resists the bureaucratic control. But one can say this is only possible within an imaginary narrative. That is, whatever I'm saying can only happen within a fictional space. Fictions that are not practical and perhaps are rendered impractical and redundant as a product of their own idealism. A discerning reader would recognize not a straw man here, but rather an echo of past complaints leveled against the idea of fiction making. And when I refer to past complaints leveled against the idea of fiction making, I'm not just talking about Plato, but I'm talking about, as recent as in 2014, Obama, who is supposed to be the politically correct face of modern politics, or at least was supposed to be the politically correct face of modern politics. He railed against liberal arts by saying a lot of young people no longer see the trades and skilled manufacturing as a viable career. But I promise you, folks can make a lot more potentially with skilled manufacturing on the trades that they might with an art history degree. It may have been surprising for a lot of people who may have found a reason for political participation in the perfectly politically correct image of Obama. But if we look at this remark in the context of the bureaucratization of discourse, this jab at the liberal arts makes perfect sense. The changing of the guard does not mean that the interests being guarded, the source of meanings also change. The contemporary resistance to poetic dynamism is, in ways of thinking, is not forced downwards in a perceptible manner, but rather is regimented through the bureaucratization of a system of cause and effect, where the cause fakes itself out of its materiality and positions itself in a transcendental realm, thus ensuring a complete and strict discipline of all the possible effects. But in order for this discipline to work, a subjectivity has to be established, which can unconsciously unsee the contradiction within the claim of hermeneutic omnipotence and hegemony of a cause that in itself has roots in materiality and is not beyond questioning. The cause proclaims, as Zizek mentioned, like the Nike ad, just do it. And this just doing without thinking about the command is part of how the contradiction defining the regimented political action hides itself. Uh, Now, the artist or the writer, like Saramago, does not operate outside the dominant discourse in some kind of transcendental vacuum which allows him to create these fictional spaces. Rather, the very efficacy of the poetic lies within its clinging on to the very roots of that discourse. The poetic is a representation of the world of discourse which it inhabits. But this mimetic function goes beyond mere copying to entertain and familiarity. It is the act of making strange the everydayness of existence, or what the Russian formalists refer to as defamiliarization, which provides the poetic function its ability to highlight the contradictions of ultimate causes. Through giving us back the everydayness of our existence in a fictionalized form, we tend to see what has gone unseen up until now through the act of relating our world experience with the fictional ones. Uh, in order to conclude, I would just like to say that the true emancipation lies in the dialectic between the poetic and the political. An action devoid of the poetic is doomed to repeat the past failures, since it is empty of the critical sensibility that the poetic provides. Saramago's novel, which has been discussed above, stand not just as a work of fiction, entertaining tales, but rather as political acts. Radical act, a radical act which ensures that meaning is not enslaved within certain popular words, but is rather emancipated back into the hands of the people. This is all. Thank you.
Thank you, Babu. Next we have Taiba Jawad from Himayat Islamia Khawateen College, and she'll be talking about food as an expression of culture. Over to you, Ms. Taiba.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm
Ji,
Tayyiba
Taiba.
Jahan. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you, the conference committee, for letting me a part of this remarkable and astonishing event. And I'm also very much thankful to Dr. AMRA Raza for who has obliged me to be a part of her panel. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. And today, the topic that I'm going to discuss is actually a part of my thesis that I did during my MPhil. It is a study of Elif Shafak's The Bastard of Istanbul, and I explore the use of uh, expression of culture and tradition in Elif Shafak's The Bastard of Istanbul as metaphors. So today, wait a minute, I should on my slides. I would like to thank you very much. Thank you. So this is my biography. A study of food and culinary metaphors in Elif Shafak's The Bastard of Istanbul. She is a Turkish writer, and my study investigates her presentation of cultural values through traditional cuisines and culinary activities. Her presentation of Turkish food as a communicational source conveys meanings which are productive and long-lasting as any other cultural sources, such as language, dresses, or literature. She has presents a family drama in the novel that involves two families, Armenians and Kazanakis. And she uses traditional food as a symbolic language to address the issues of cultural identity and traditional values. Through traditional food affiliations, she has presented a family drama set in the events of 1915. There are two families. One is Muslim, other is Christian. and their conflicts and their separation, all is depicted through the use of cultural cuisines, and especially the use of ashur. Ashur is a cultural dish that is prepared in Turkey, and all sorts of religions, they participate in the preparation of this food. The Armenians and Kazakhs who dispersed during the genocide in Turkey finally meet in Kazanki Konak in Istanbul, and the traditional food plays an important part in alleviating the differences originating, originated in 1950. And here, especially, Ashur performs the function of cultural connector. It is very interesting to note that her novel, it consists of several chapters, and these chapters are entitled after the ingredients which are used in the preparation of ashur. The sequence of events revolves around the conflicts between these two families for generations and their acceptance and rejection of cultural values through food choices. There are several women in this novel, and these women belong to several generations, mostly four generations, and the novel consists of their endeavor to maintain their identity with being quintessentially Turkish. These food references are constant aid memoirs of the cautious observance of prestigious cultural culinary deliverance from older to younger generation. And this deliverance is usually done by the women. All right, these chapter titles, as you can see, cinnamon, garbanzo beans, sugar, etc. These are all the part of this ashur dish, which is a sweet dish, and it represents and conveys the underlying importance and connection of sharing of traditional food and culinary culture. In the novel, we can see several characters of both families, and they actually make a family tree. And it is very interesting that these families, they separated, then they rejoined in Istanbul, and the thing that joined them or brought them together or reconnected them was nothing else but the cultural food, especially ashur, that brought them together at the end. From beginning till the end in the novel, this special food is again and again mentioned by Shepard, and it conveys the feelings and emotions of these characters. And at the end, we see that how these feelings and emotions were deep rooted in their culture, and it helped them getting together, or it also helped them bringing them closer. They rejoined in Istanbul, where two young girls, Asya and Ermanouch, they search for their ancestral history, and aromas and tastes of Istanbul reminds them that they belong to the same soil. Why are not here we can see the use of pomegranate brooch that was associated. Pomegranate seeds were associated with ashur. They were sprinkled over the ashur dish in order to present it more admirably. And that is also used by the characters in the novel as a special thing, as a legend. They keep it to themselves, and then they pass it on to their several generations. And at the end, from the beginning in 1914, they dispersed, and when they rejoined at the end, This broach, it traveled through both families, and at last it reached to them. The thing that I want to clear is that the use of culinary and cuisines and the cultural foods by Shafak in the novel, it is not only there just to tell a tale. Actually, it brings out a complete sort of a history. Shafak uses these cuisines to present that how these cultural foods, they are deeply merged into the systems of the natives, and they travel throughout the generation. These two families dispersed. One was living in Turkey, the other was outside Turkey. They were in America, but as living apart, living far away, they never forget the taste and the aromas of their cultural dishes. Armenians at diaspora again and again show their affiliation, their love, their respect for their cultural cuisines and dishes. As you can see, the diasporas, while living abroad, all their women, they were constantly involved in cooking, and they remind their next generation how to prepare, how to preserve the cultural taste so that they can convey the bond that was connecting them to their country. Living abroad was not easy for them. Leaving their country was not easy for them. But still, it was their traditional dishes that were there for them to rejoin them. All the girls, all the women, again and again, they are there to present them. There are several other dishes also mentioned in the novel, but the one thing that is there is the preparation of ashu. And my study investigates how these dishes, how these cultural and traditional cuisines, they play their important role in depicting the psychology as well as the love and emotion of these two different worlds or different religious worlds, and bringing them apart together again at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tayeba. Now we have Sarish Makbool from University of Lahore, and she'll be talking about politics of globalization. Over to you, Sarish. We have a few minutes left for this session.
Thank you, Rida. Thank you for introducing me. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I hope I am audible to everyone. Thank you.
Serish, we can't see you. Could you switch on your
Yes, ma'am. I'll show you that.
Thank you. I hope this is not a case of seeing following blindness or blindness following seeing. Yes, there you are.
Is it visible now?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. So let me just share my screen with you. Sorry for the delay. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So the topic the topic of my presentation is Politics of Globalization, a critical study of red birds by Muhammad Huni. The point that I discuss in this presentation is that globalization, as it is presented to us with its promises of free trade, free mobility is not as it seems to be. There is so much haziness attached with this term, which Zygmunt Bauman described in his work, Globalization, the Human Consequences. And I try to, analyze this novel, Red Birds by Muhammad Hanif, according to that, or by borrowing that theorized explanation of globalization. So Wikipedia, or our general understanding of the term globalization, is that it's a process of interaction and integration among people, companies, and governments worldwide, and it allows it is an economic process of interaction and integration that is associated with social and cultural aspects. On the other hand, Zygmunt Bauman disagrees with this general understanding of globalization. He says that it's a fad world, which is fast turning into a shibboleth. In his introduction, he introduces his readers to the idea that globalization is not as simple or as truthful as it appears to be. Rather, it has a mist around it which should be dispersed, and which he did in his work. Globalization as a process promises one global world, one grand structure, which is fair, which provides opportunities, equal opportunities for everyone under that universal system. But if we look around, there is poverty, disease, lethal viruses, violent confrontations, religious fundamentalism, and environmental degradation which surrounds us. The current human and environmental condition intrigues me to explore that if globalization promises us a more fair, just, and sustainable world, then why is it that such consequences are being faced and endured by certain segments of society? So hence, in this present study, I tried to analyze red birds to explore how globalization functions, what are its consequences, and can we resist globalization's challenges, or the circumstances it poses to us. So these are my research questions. The method is qualitative in nature. I did the textual analysis of the red birds employing Zygmunt Bauman's idea of globalization. So, Red Birds by Hanif portrays a world where this process of globalization only benefits the global elite, which is global north. However, the global south suffers the brunt of the global initiatives and undertakings, as global effects are notoriously unintended and unanticipated. Some of the consequences of globalization are militarized security states, just as presented in the novel, rising violent confrontations, precarious labor, and exploitation of local resources. Red Birds, the novel by Hanif, opens in a refugee camp in an unnamed Middle Eastern region where rehabilitation work is in process after the war. The bombings have destroyed people's houses and the entire infrastructure of the place. The place has nothing to steal, as mentioned by Momo, one of the narrative voices of the novel. He says that the place has nothing to steal because everything has already been stolen. It is a camp without water taps, without roads, but you do pay road taxes. It's a camp with electric poles, but without electricity. So even the boundary wall has been ripped off. So in this globalized world where these big organizations like USAID, these big programs, USAID, UN Food Program, Red Crescents, all these programs and these superpowers are working, with these developing nations. But the results that we are seeing, they are quite disturbing. They are not as promised. So before conclusion, I would like to read some of my discussion from the paper. This far of place of the novel is a militarized part of a state which is ambivalent to the place under its sovereign territory, as Momo mentions, that it's not on their maps. So when Major Ellie asks him that, you are driving this jeep, you are not licensed to drive this jeep, and he said the police doesn't know, our area is not on their maps. So yet the state has authorized these global forces to first bomb this place to get rid of the combatants and then do the rehabilitation work that involves capital. This internal conflict is supposed to remain a local affair, but it has been globalized by the states to secure aid and from global institutions for its less inclusive projects, which consequently increases the resentment of the neo-tribal groups doublefold. Initially, the nation state fails to include all the segments of the society in its process of development. Therefore, in reaction to this inability of the state, the non-state actors gain power and exploit the leftover segments of the society with the promise of change, which is never fulfilled neither by the state, their global allies, or nor by the non-state actors. As Bauman puts it aptly, that globalization creates progressive spatial segregation, separation, and exclusion. Neo-tribal and fundamental tendencies are as much legitimate offsprings of globalization as widely acclaimed hybridization of dog culture. The interesting observation is that not only these non-state actors, but the global powers also buy the services of local people. For instance, in the novel, it is shown that Bro Ali works for the American soldiers as a spy. He takes this transistor and he goes, he gives them signals, and then after the bomb explodes. Other children of the locality also given these menial jobs, just as such as cleaning up, clearing kitchens, bathrooms. They got to keep those rubber gloves. They got paid in new crisp notes. Sometimes they were sent off into the desert to lay mines. They got extra money for that. Moreover, Father Dear also works as the US aid logistics officer, whose duty is to ensure that nobody goes in the hangar, not even him, and manages some records and files. Globalization apparently promises a universal order or system, but we see, these opportunities are not equal for everyone, as it is evident in the novel that Father Dear, Bro Ali, Momo, and Allah's servant, they try to make to the global world or global economy, but this obscure system does not allow them, as they remain fixed in their localities. Father Dear's job is as a logistic officer in US aid is of precarious nature, because it has been 7 months that the hangar is closed and there is nobody he can ask where and why it has been restructured. There are people waiting for the free rations, other supplies, and their salaries, but they are abandoned by the state and the intruders and the do-gooders. Boma also talks about this same phenomena. He says that employees are recruited from the local population and burdened, but they could not easily follow the company when it moves elsewhere. Momo, an inspiring entrepreneur in his teens, wants to exhaust every possible opportunity to be a responsible member of his family, but all his dreams, plans, and strategies are in vain, as the system which divides this world into two parts, haves and have-nots, does not allow it to be. Hence, they are fixed in their local place and left to deal with it. It also
Sahaj,
becomes apparent that these
Sahaj,
individuals are not aimlessly enduring the loss,
uh,
enduring the
Sahaj,
loss of their home. Sorry, is
sorry, Sahaj, you'll have to stop here. We are running out of time. We have 2 or 3 minutes just to wrap up and have a very small question answer session. Thank you so much, and I'm very sorry for the inconvenience that you had to be cut out. Uh, Over to you, Dr. Raza, for the end, our respected chair.
Thank you all. I felt very, very privileged today to be chairing such such an informative session. It was very, very inspiring. I'm sorry that you all had, you must have felt that you had too little time, but that is how it was. Just a few remarks, quick summaries, and a few connections between your papers. Amongst your papers, sorry. Dr. Usman Sari's paper used Rohan Pamuk's text as a jumping board for idea that in order for decolonization to occur, the semiotic system of a modern or enlightened state can be challenged by a counter-signifying regime. Thank you for the lovely miniatures, Usma, the bringing together of the old and the new, the visual and the verbal, and the intertextualities generated in the Eastern and Western narratives. I really enjoyed that. The application of Freudian theory in your paper was a precursor to Dr. Mariam Zia's paper, Negotiating Meaning, the Case of the Uncanny and Ajibo-Gharib. Like Dr. Ansari's paper, it was also rooted in paradox and drew on Freudian theory. The explanations of the Unheimlich and its extensions of meanings were extremely interesting. Now, since I know German, Unheimlich actually directly agar transliterate kare, so it means unhomely. So I found it very interesting that you went into all those different languages in order to explain its extensions of meanings, which were very, very interesting, especially when linked with the Ajibo-Gharib. Both papers challenged the norm and proposed that paradoxes were the only path to interpretation. Dr. Wasim Haidar's paper on dynamics of neocolonialism in Adichie's novel discussed the hegemonic entanglement of neo-colonial powers acting as a catalyst in the Nigerian Civil War. It also examined the post-colonial period and the complexities which affect the characters negatively. Babar Khan Suri, the first thing I want to say to you is I'm very, very jealous of you sitting in the University of Punjab, the University of Karachi, my alma mater. So I don't know if any of my teachers are still there, but I really wish I was there with you. And I hope that you are doing, and I'm sure you're doing the university proud, at least you have today. You talked about Saramango's sequel to his own novel, Blindness, titled Seeing, with a political plot. So since I haven't read these texts, your talk greatly inspired me to buy these books. Your premise is the radical political emancipation and democracy, which allows the mutation of emancipation into its opposite. It focused on the bureaucratization of discourse. I found that very, very interesting, this angle. Then Tayyiba, you discuss food as an expression of culture and tradition in Shafak's novel. This was the wrong time to discuss food because we all want to go home. Your paper investigated the use of traditional food as a symbolic language to examine cultural identity and, of course, traditional values. The elaborate family tree of food charts were very, very interesting, you know, where I associate those charts with the family tree and you had used or superimposed them symbiotically with food charts. Sehrish, it was good to see you in your Politics of Globalization, a critical study of redbirds by Muhammad Hanif. You analyze the phenomena of globalization and its promises, as well as the spawning of religious fundamentalism and violence through Muhammad Hanif's texts. Now, what I noted was that all of you were extremely creative. So as researchers in the arts and humanities, you're not discovering truths, you're actually creating truths. So thank you very much for qualifying what this conference is all about. You challenge the conventional ways of looking at texts. I noticed that most of the presenters today used paradoxes, and from the challenges you posed to the texts, you invited listeners to revisit them by offering alternative meanings, thus the identification of paradoxes led to redefinition of meanings and thus resulted in reinterpretations. All presentations challenged appearances, and you did use critical theory to pry open the texts, but you used it not only to challenge the surface level, I think, perspectives, but to explore the unpleasant truths, some of the unpleasant truths buried deep, deep underneath. I would also like to thank you for drawing attention to the different types of languages that you all examined. Bureaucratization of language, food as language, the spawning of meanings for unheimlich, and semiotic systems. So amazing work. Please keep it up. Thank you very, very much for being here. And Dr. Shahzeb Khan, thank you very much for all your assistance as conference coordinator. All my colleagues, my students, take care, keep safe, and I hope that your families are also well. Thank you. It was a wonderful experience. Thank you very much. And goodbye.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for